Greetings to you all. Greetings to you all, and welcome to the Surface Trust Policy Dialogue Forum. Today, Mika, today we are looking at human rights, organized violence and torture, and forcible displacements in Zimbabwe, the past and present. And we have a very eminent panel of persons who have been very involved in this exercise over the years. And to take us into the discussion, my job here is to introduce our moderator, my colleague and sister, Frances Lovemore. Frances is a medical doctor who has been involved in documentation and treatment of victims of torture and organized violence over the years. She's been involved in research methods of empowering survivors to address issues of reparations and redress, both locally and internationally. Dr. Lovemore is the current director of the Counseling Services Unit, CSU, in Harare, which works to help victims and survivors of organized torture and violence. She's also the chairperson of the Survivor Support Group in the National Transition Working Group. Frances, welcome. It's now up to you to take us through. Frances.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It's my pleasure tonight to be the moderator of this really important forum to discuss the impact of organized violence and torture and forcible displacements in Zimbabwe. I think that we're all very aware of the long history of forced displacements and the lack of durable solutions for people who are displaced and the impact on their lives. But I think what hasn't really ever been highlighted is how many displacements are accompanied by what is basically crimes against humanity in terms of the organized violence and torture that happens to the people who are being displaced without solution, and the impact on their futures. And there are many thousands of people in this country who have never felt settled in any one place. They've never felt that they can actually get on with their lives. So this forum is really to introduce a paper that has been prepared highlighting how many times organized violence and torture occurs with displacement, and also to discuss recommendations. The author of the paper, Tony Rila, I think everybody knows him, but I think it's fair to say that he's really the grandfather of activists in this country post-independence. He really has led the charge on protecting and highlighting human rights abuses and developing much of what we have in terms of civil society and the defense of human rights in this country. He currently is the senior researcher at Research and Advocacy Unit, and I think that's just a part-time job for him because he's involved in so many other things that are going on. But he does give the Research and Advocacy Unit a lot of very good papers that are able to be entered into the important discussions around protecting human rights in this country. We're also joined by Maxine Chesweto, who is a legal researcher working with Veritas, who has a special interest in internal displacement in Zimbabwe and has been tracking and documenting for the last 2 years and really highlighting the legal aspects of this. And then followed by Farai Magu, who is the director of the Center of Natural Resources and Governance in Zimbabwe. It's a leading organization working on improved governance of natural resources in our country. He's done extensive research, and I can vouch that he has done extensive research and documentation on human rights, conflict minerals, and illicit trade in Zimbabwe's natural resources. And he is a diehard activist. In 2010, he was arrested for his human rights, detained and charged and detained for 40 days. And in 2011, he was honored with the Alison Deplorable Award for extraordinary activism, and it was a very well-deserved award because he has never given up on this really hard battle, because the mineral wealth of this country is one of the big conflict zones. He was honored by Rappaport, a clean diamond campaigner, for protecting artisanal diamond miners in Zimbabwe's Marangi region. And he's also a PhD candidate at the Wits School of Governance in Johannesburg and holds an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies from the European University Center for Peace Studies in Austria, and a Master in Peace and Governance from Africa University. And he also has a graduate of UZ. So I think that we have a very eminent panel. I'm going to ask that Tony kicks off, and he's going to speak for about 20 minutes, followed by Maxine, and then by Farai. If you've got questions, maybe put them into the chat box so that we can start to bunch them. And then I will also track people raising their hands or wanting to intervene. But it would be good to get at least through the presentations and discussions, and then move into the open dialogue. But we can adjust if required. But don't forget the chat box function. And I think the moderator has the ability, not me, the other moderator has the ability to mute people who are not on mute. So I'm going to hand over to Tony. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Apologies, everyone. My screen, my video apparently doesn't work. I got a new computer and it's baffled me. And those of us who are heading towards the latter part of our lives are not so clever at fixing this. And I don't have a 17-year-old right around me at the moment who can fix it. So thank you, Francis, for those remarks. I'd like to share my screen, and I'm glad I did a PowerPoint presentation. I wasn't going to use it and talk more alive, but I'm glad I did that, because this way you can do it. So I'm going to share my screen, if I may, and let me open that. Okay, and let's see. Right, slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so I'm really trying to give a historical perspective and an understanding of why displacements are so important. In many ways, forced displacements are the poor relative of all the crimes that are included in the field of human rights violations. Somehow they don't seem as terrible and awful as torture or extrajudicial executions or rape. People just move. So I want to start by talking about displacement in some more general terms. And I'd like all of you who are listening to think about the word that's in the middle of it there, place. I want you to think about place. And I want to think about what place means to you. What is your place? And I think that when you begin to think about place, words come to you like my home, the place where my family is, the community within which my family and my home are part of the place. It's a very, very central bit, and I think it has been a central bit of human existence since we moved from hunter-gatherers to becoming agricultural people. It became very, very important around place. So place very often, and very much in the last 30 years, has become sort of synonymous with property rights, that I lose my right to property in a very material sense. I want to talk about this in a deep psychological, social, anthropological, and even spiritual way. What is behind displacement? And when you think about the place, it is this place where often you're born. You know, you connect your birth to a place. It's often the place where you grow up. You grow up and you learn life with your elders and your peers. It's often a place where you marry. And when you marry, you end up having children. And those children grow up and they have other children. They become grandchildren. There's this great continuity of life around place. And they also, I think it's not just in Africa, I think it's all across the world, there are also places, the place where often we die, and unless you live in big cities, they're often the place where we're buried. And in that whole cycle of life around place, place becomes this link between the past and the present and the future. It's deep. So when people are displaced, as Francis said, the effects are huge. They're not trivial, they're massive. It's always traumatic, and it goes on for generations. Francis referred to that. So we need to think that moving people from one place to another against their will is a massively traumatic, long-standing event in people's lives. And as Francis pointed out, very often do not recover. So it's also a legal concept, and I'm sure Maxine's going to talk about this more, but forced displacement was quite clearly placed as part of the definitions of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It is not seen as trivial. It is seen as equivalent to all the other violations that take place. It was also very specifically put in the Southern African definition of organized violence and torture that many of us put together in 1990 because of colonial history and apartheid. And in 2003, Zimbabweans made a very clear point in looking at transitional justice for the future that displacement held a very central part of it. The forced moving of people now for nearly 130 years in this country has had devastating effects. But the key legal feature is that this displacement is part, as the ICC statute says, a wider or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So this is intentional displacement. For whatever reasons, displacement happens. Now, the key in what I'm trying to say is that very often people do not voluntarily move. They're forced. And within that forced displacement come a whole plethora of other violations. So let's look at the pre-independence era. I mean, I am not going to try and cover the colonial displacements from the early arrival of the settlers, but it is a history of forced displacement. And they lost land. And too often we talk about, in the current context, about the loss of land. People did not just lose land, they lost their identity. Terrible things happened to them as a consequence. They were cut off from the links between the past and the present and the future. And it was devastating on them. So there's a whole history there of a very long time. There are also the war-related displacements. And sometimes I'm discouraged with the younger population that they have no concept very often of just how devastating the displacements were during the Liberation War. And just very quickly, and I'm not going to spend a long time in this, you have to think of 750,000 people placed in keeps. By one estimate, there were 199 keeps from the Dande to Chiredzi along the whole eastern border of this country in which these people lived, were forced to live. They were moved from their homes and placed in what were called protected villages, but were little better than concentration camps in the end. And the consequences of that life were enormous, incredible deprivation and extreme poverty. And very importantly, in the cycle of place that I'm talking about, the massive disruption of children's development. There are a number of publications that point out that children lost schooling. We had to go through a whole exercise in the 1980s after independence to catch people up on all the missed years of being displaced. And for some people, beginning in 1972, they were displaced for 8 years. That's an immensely long time. That's almost a child's whole life. And I don't think that we have adequately documented that story. There are some good books, but I don't think anybody sat down and done the academic research to really understand the impact on people of those displacements. When we move to post-independence, now this report that's being launched today really deals with two major displacements. There are many others, and certainly many current ones. And I'm going to leave that to Maxine and to Farai to talk about. And I'll just concentrate very quickly on two of the ones that really impacted us visibly right across the country: Operation Murambachina and the land invasions. And I'm not going to get into the detail of what happened with Operation Murambachina. I'm going to talk to you about the consequences, the human consequences that they faced. And some of you will remember that a special envoy was sent here, Anna Tipojuka, who produced a report, an extremely detailed report, and a report that caused considerable controversy. It caused so much controversy that when it was suggested that it be tabled at the UN Security Council, it was blocked. But those initial gatherings were followed by a much more detailed study done by Zimbabwean human rights groups under the umbrella of Action Aid. And they interviewed a very large number of people about their experience under Operation Murambachina. And if you begin to look quickly at the kind of impact that it had on them, okay? This was forced displacement, okay? And intentional. People were told to move, to stop doing things. Their shelter was taken down. So it fits that definition of a widespread and systematic attack with the intention to do it. 70% of people reported that they'd lost shelter. Now remember, the overall figure was something like close to 1 million people were affected by Murambachina. So you're talking about 70% of 1 million people who lost shelter. 76% said they lost their sources of income. Now these are features that go with forced displacement. School dropout was reported to be 22%. 22% of the kids dropped out. And a further, I think 40% of parents reported that the loss of income meant that they were now really struggling to keep their kids at school. Property, 48% said they had incurred loss of property. Their property was either destroyed and very often stolen. Their health, slightly over 25% of people saw that the deterioration of themselves or their loved ones came as a direct effect of the operation. Remember, people had to sleep outside, they were deprived of food, they often didn't have access to health. Food security. Half of this population said that they became food insecure. They lost their money, and this was urban, and in urban areas, money means food. Half of the population said that household safety and security had been compromised. 40% said that their family units had been disrupted. That meant families had to move out and they had to send kids somewhere, they had to send somebody to Kumusha, they had to move in with relatives, and some of them relatives could take some, but not others. So the whole disruption of the family unit, and go back to what I was saying in the beginning, how central that all is, and increased vulnerability for women, children, and orphans. 35% said that women and children had become more vulnerable as a consequence of the operation. So these are massive human consequences that come with displacement. And I think that if you went to a refugee population, like the Mozambican refugees with whom I worked in the late 80s and the 90s, they would report all of these things as well, okay? But that was in the context of a war and not a so-called urban cleansing. Now, I mentioned that they have long-term persistent consequences. Displacement affects people's psychological health. In this study, they also looked at whether people had suffered from psychological disturbance. So all the people were also screened to see whether they had psychological disturbance. And you can see the numbers there. In Harare, and these are big numbers, there's a big sample, 570, 80% met the criteria for having an active psychological disorder. In Bulawayo, it was 51%, and in Mutare, it was 71%. So the consequence was also to impact upon their psychological health. Now, I don't know of any study that has tried to go back and see where all of these people are today. because one of the big issues about the trauma that goes with forced displacement is that it often requires professional help. And we don't know how many of these people, and that's an enormous number of people, ever received any legitimate assistance for the trauma that they experienced. The consequence of that, and I think in this report that the organizations who are part of it make this conclusion, and Anna Tibajauka made the same conclusion. The conclusion was that this quite clearly met the criteria of a crime against humanity. And I will say that that was an unpopular conclusion by the Special Envoy, but subsequently a number of organizations looked at this with a much more legal eye, and they arrived at the same conclusion. The Oxford Pro Bono Publica unit came to that conclusion, as did several other legal firms. So that's Operation Murambachina. Now, Operation Murambachina, of course, was a lightning strike. It happened over the best part of a week. The next one we want to talk about was an extended period of displacement, and that's to do with the land invasions. Now, I'm not going to get into the merits of land reform and its necessity, etc., etc. What I'm going to focus on here is the research that GAPUS did, the General Agricultural and Plantation Workers Unit of Zimbabwe, who represented all the commercial farm workers working on commercial farms. So whatever happened during the land invasions, it was clear that people lost their homes. Whether they were farm workers and not holding title is less the issue than they lost their homes. What was estimated was that by GAPUS, and Relief Web confirmed this, is something like 78% of farm workers were displaced over about a 4-year period. The estimate was that between 325 and 450,000 workers were displaced. Those were the people who worked on the farm, but their families lived there. And their families had often lived there for 2 generations and possibly more. And that meant that about between 1.5 and 2 million people were displaced. That's an enormous number of people who were moved from place. They lost their livelihoods and therefore their ability to earn. They lost a safety net because very often the place, even if you regarded them as indentured laborers and at the mercy of mercenary commercial farmers, there were safety nets of some kind around them. They lost those safety nets. And as with the Liberation War, their children's development was interfered with and terminated. So the impact was huge and took place over a long period of time. Now, the difference between this and Operation Murambachina is the time scale. When something happens bit by bit, drip by drip by drip, you don't notice it in the same way. You know, you hear 6 farms there or 20 there. You don't see the total aggregate in terms of people of what is happening. And all of us have memories of commercial farm workers on the side of the road with their possessions trying to figure out where to go. So it very much is a trickle-down displacement. It doesn't have the same singular event that happens with Operation Murambachina. If you look at what happened to them, the kinds of things that they happened, you have to look at the kinds of violations that they experienced. And if you look along the bottom there, you will see the violations are extremely serious. And when you talk about their personal experience, you can see people talked about torture, death threats, assault, forced to watch beatings. Many farm workers were taken to pumwes where they were forced to witness the violations of others, abductions. These are extremely serious crimes. And they fit within the context of the ICC statute, the notion of crime against humanity. The consequences for them were deeply serious. Unfortunately, nobody in this research did what they did in Murambachina and tried to look at the same time at what the traumatic consequences for people. But there was a small study done of, I think it was about 150 displaced farm workers in 2002 by the Omani Trust. And they found the rates of psychological disorder there extremely high. And what this little graph will show you are studies looking at victims of OVT, from the victims of the Liberation War in Chiweshi, Mount Darwin, Zurubani, riot victims, Mozambican refugees, war veterans. Studies done by the Omani Trust showed the amount of psychological disorder amongst war veterans was exceptionally high, but the amount of psychological disorder amongst commercial farm workers was extravagantly high, the highest rate that we'd had in the country to that date. So the point I'm trying to make, and I hope everybody will read the report will shortly be available. We will make sure that the link is provided as soon as we can to everybody who's here, and widely anyhow. The point is, you cannot see forced displacement as being the poor sister of gross human rights violations. It is serious, and possibly the most serious, because what always goes with forced displacement are all the other violations, as we demonstrated with the commercial farm workers: torture, rape, abductions, murders. They all go together with forced displacements. And therefore, it's an umbrella that encapsulates all these violations. So therefore, it is critical that, and we should have learned this from the Liberation War and the stories that people told of being displaced from their home and their lives, that this is something that has to be done with extreme care. And even if it's not in the context of political conflict, any displacement of people from their homes and their place and their lives has to be done with such care and such caring, and with full concentration of the people to avoid the people being traumatized. Thank you very much, Francis.
Thank you, Tony, for that very, very comprehensive oversight of the actual psychological impact of forced displacement. And I think we cannot overemphasize the long-term effects and the intergenerational effects of displacement. I'm going to hand over now to Maxine. Maxine, are you online? Can you hear? Would you like to carry on, please?
Yes, I am here. I would like to share my screen. Can you just do that? Sorry. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Right. All right. So my name is Maxine Chisweta. I am going to do forcible displacements. Sorry, my screen. Forcible displacements, house demolitions, and arbitrary evictions in Zimbabwe. And I have been tasked to look into specifically urban matters and the laws that are related to urban matters. I believe Farai is going to look at the rural aspect of it, including farms, communal lands, etc. So to get us started. So how I'm going to go about this is that I'm going to look at the story, I'm going to look at the Constitution, I'm going to look at the acts and the statutory instruments that are related to arbitrary evictions and displacements, right? So to set us off, I think Tony had sort of gotten us going on this one, but it's also just very important before I start to define these three words as they're critical to understanding the law and to understand the stories of the people on the ground. So to start off, we're going to look at what eviction means. UN Habitat has described eviction as a permanent or temporary removal against the will of the individuals, families, or communities from their homes or land which they occupy. Arbitrary. According to the dictionary, this means something based on a personal choice or whim, something not based on a system or reason. Remember that, that's very important. An eviction of a person in a way that is not fair or just. And this is usually the case in evictions that take place without a court order and without allowing the other side to be heard. And third, home, the word home. According to the South African Constitutional Court, in the dispatch municipality case, a home is any structure which protects a person from natural elements. It is a place where they wish to stay permanently or temporarily for residential purposes and can be housing that is rented, or a shack is also considered a home, right? So that's extensive to South Africa, but it will help us in shaping and looking at the law that we have, and as well as our constitution. So I like telling stories. So I'm going to tell you guys a story about Jim. This is Jim and his family. As you can see, Jim has 2 kids, a wife. This is Zimbabwe. Jim probably lives with 3 or 4 other relatives and a house help, etc. So Jim lives in a house that is located on a plot which he bought from a housing cooperative in, say, 2010. And since 2010, Jim has contributed about $4,000 US dollars in total to this housing cooperative, right? So as we mentioned, he lives there with his wife, his 2 children, relatives on the plot. Jim is making a life for himself. As Tony mentioned, when it comes to housing, it's so important to realize that it's not the shelter, but it's the community around him. It's the health facilities, it's the children going to school, it's literally the whole quality of life of someone. So from about 2010 to now, Jim lives on this land peacefully, enjoying the benefits of being a homeowner. And eventually, somewhere along the line, since 2010, the city council even comes and makes water connections for Jim and his community. And that's great. So although somewhere along the line as well, they hear a little bit of rumors about there being a dispute about housing corporations, about a struggle with the city council, but nothing ever really comes to fruition from those squabbles. They just hear them in the background. They just whispers. So as fast forward, everything has happened. At some point, they're told that they need to regularize, so it's called regularization, where they make sure that all their papers are in order with the city council, etc. Fast forward December 2020, bulldozers show up and half of their neighborhood is destroyed. Literally, they're told just a few hours before that the bulldozer is here, get what you can. Their identity documents are lost, their clothing is lost, their whole livelihood is lost. Now, I know I've been saying Jim and his family, and I've used a cartoon, but this is a common thing that has been happening over and over and over again in Zimbabwe. It's happened in Budiro 4. This story of Jim is actually the story of Budiro 4. It's happened in Arlington. It's happened in Chitungiza. It's happened in many other areas. So even as Tony mentioned, sometimes we don't see the effects of these evictions because they happen in small clusters, in small neighborhoods. But with Budiro 5 recently, it was 190 houses. Before that, Budiro 4, we're talking about 100 houses. Arlington, we're talking about in the hundreds as well. So all of this builds up to make a considerable size of the population, which is being made homeless in effect by the actions of the city council. So issues arising from Jim's story. So in order to understand the effects and what has really happened to Jim and what laws they have based these evictions on, we need to look at them step by step. So like my PowerPoint, my bullet points say, What laws, if any, protect Jim and his family? Are there local laws adequate? Is there anything that can be done? Are demolitions arbitrary? Demolitions and arbitrary evictions constitutional? And like I mentioned, I think in the beginning, there was no court order when it comes to the evictions of Udiro, Arlington, Chitungiza, etc. So if there was a court order, on what basis would this court order be given? But even still, if we give the court order, have we gone through due process to make sure that, in effect, we're not leaving these people homeless? In effect, we're not changing the trajectory of these people's lives forever. So I'd like to start from the top, which is the Constitution as we know it. As you know, we have a new Constitution in quotes from 2013. So the direct protections that we have are Section 74 of the Constitution, which says that there should be no evictions or demolitions without a court order. Of course, the section is quite extensive, but for the sake of time, I've just taken out things that are buzzwords that are directly relevant to us. And then this is complemented by Section 28. Section 28 isn't necessarily a right as Section 74. So Section 74 is under the Bill of Rights, meaning that this is something that's basically done and dusted. We are afforded this right to an extent, and I'll come back to that. Section 28 places the obligation, the positive obligation on the government to realize or to give us access to adequate shelter. But of course, there has limitations such as within the limits of resources available. So that is the limitation, right? And then we also go to Section 68, which is administrative justice, which means that whenever there is a matter, so going back to Jim, right? Where Jim was supposed to be evicted, Jim was supposed to be given the right to be heard. There's a common law maxim called the audi autem partem rule in Latin, which means that the other side must also be heard. So administratively, due process was meant to be followed if we are evicting Jim. What laws are we specifically basing and saying that we're following step A, B, C, D in order to get Jim out of this house, out of this property, off this land, if we're saying that this land is indeed illegal land and Jim has settled there illegally? And then Section 69 gives the right to access to courts. So this complements administrative justice in the fact that before we even evict Jim, before we should again give him the right to stand before a court to say that I think that ABC, because I was sold this house by a housing corporation, I have a right to this land. I have a right to live here. I have made my community here. And in Section 86(2), the limitation clause. So this is sort of the pushback clause. So in certain instances, with any rights that you've been given in the Constitution, so the right, Section 78 that I mentioned earlier, there's a limitation clause. Your rights can be limited in certain instances where the limitation is fair, it's reasonable, it's just, and it follows that type of reasoning. I will come back to this later. So that is the Constitution. Now we're talking about the local laws, the urban laws, I guess, so to call it. And this is what mainly the city council bases its evictions on. So even though some of them are contrary to the Constitution, some of them do agree with the Constitution. But I'd just like to jump on my slide because I'm looking at the Urban Councils Act. But before I look at sections 180, 199, and 213, I'd like to specifically mention the council bylaws from 1979. Now, if the devil was to have descendants on earth, then it must be in the form of SI 109/79. Most of the evictions that are taking place right now in the country, especially in urban areas, are being based on section 18 of SI 109/79. So what this section basically says, it's an all-encompassing section. It just says dangerous housing, dilapidated housing, unhealthy housing, houses that do not conform to the plans of city council or building standard can be demolished and the people can be evicted. So this section in itself is a drastic power, and the core and city council has used it in numerous cases. We've got the Zimbabwe case. We've got I just want to get this name right, but I can't seem to find it. Oh, the Mukungu Rutse case. And time and again, city council has come and said that no, but we are evicting according to SI 109/79. And the thing that SI 109/79 does is that it doesn't even mandate for there to be a court order. So that is why the city council right now is getting away with demolishing houses and evicting people without a court order, because they are basing it on section 109/79 over 79. But if you remember, well, we talked about in the Constitution, where it says that people have a specific right not to be arbitrarily evicted. And a couple of judges have actually referred to this and said that SI 109/79 is unconstitutional. But as you all know, to date, nothing has been done to repeal this or to even say that it's not supposed to be used. One thing we must also remember about SI 109/79 is the time and the era that these laws were enacted. You must remember that this was a time when Africans were not really afforded what we now call real rights. So in effect, we are using something that our colonizer used. We're using something that was meant to harm the people, that is not in line with our 2013 constitution, but we're still using it. Now, going back to the top, sections 180 and 186 of the Urban Councils Act do allow demolitions, but in very few instances where structures are built over drains, sewers, water mains. But even so, in this case, 30 days notice must be given to the people on the land. And then section 199 allows demolitions in contravention with conditions of title. And then 213, buildings that encroach roads, etc., may be demolished. But even so, in these cases, these people are compensated. These people are moved, and they may be compensated temporarily or permanently, but there is some sort of plan to relocate them, right? And then the Housing Standards Control Act. So this act also allows demolitions in very specific instances. So demolitions for buildings which are unsuitable for occupation. But even in such a case, the person is notified well in advance, in reasonable time, to say that we've identified this house or this structure as one that must be demolished. And they're even given the chance to demolish the house or the structure themselves before the city council comes in and demolishes. So once the notice has been given and the owner ignores this notice, only then, after they've not adhered to the court order, does the city council come in and then they demolish the house or the structure. And then the last one that I want to touch on is the Land Acquisition Act. So Section 9 of the Land Acquisition Act says that there must be given 3 months notice of evictions, and eviction of former owners of land that's acquired by the state or some other acquiring authority, and then failure to evacuate, you are in contempt of court. The problem with this one as well is that there's that phrase, that acquiring authority. we don't really know who that acquiring authority is. And so the acquiring authority can literally become anybody. Now, just to round up on the things that I have said, one thing that we must look at as well in how Zimbabwe has given court orders. When court orders are given and the city council claims that, oh no, we have a court order, and so we can legally evict these people, is that we haven't really mapped out, so to say, what it means to have a sufficient court order. What is it that the courts are supposed to look at? Because the section says that a court order is only issued once all relevant circumstances have been considered. So in South Africa, in a case called Changing Tides, they actually did come up with sort of a matrix of how these court orders should be issued. And they've got about 9 or 10 things, which I won't go into much detail right now, but for the sake of leaving it up for, I'm hoping that we'll get to it in discussion. But just to round up, there is still a lot that we in Zimbabwe need to do. There's also the international laws that through our constitution have said that we are going to take it and we're going to adapt into our own law. And so all these evictions that we are carrying out, no matter the situation, no matter where we say they are land barons, there's political issues behind it, no matter the situation, there is no legal justification for evictions without court orders, and there is no legal justification for evictions without relocation, whether the relocation is temporary or the relocation is permanent, and there is definitely no justification for evictions or demolitions without prior and sufficient notice. I will hand over back to you, Dr. Lovemore.
Thank you very much, Maxine. That was a brilliant presentation, and you have a rare ability as a lawyer to unobfuscate the law. It was so clearly presented. Thank you. And it also raises the very vexatious questions around, who are the duty bearers and who are the duty bearers to protect our population from being dragged into these terrible situations where they are basically deemed illegal after they have been deemed legal, and who pays the bills for what has happened to the people, and where is their right to reparation? Where do we find the right to reparation for these? Literally, I think, Maxine, we must be in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who've been affected by just the last 5 to 10 years of these laws being used. Farai, I would very much like to hand over to you. I think you were online when I introduced you, but Farai, please take it away with the aspects from the rural land issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lovemore. Thank you so much, Maxine and Tony, for those very brilliant presentations. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'll take it up from where the two first speakers left, and I'll give some experiences from rural areas. So basically, I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to overburden you with a subject which is not part of my work. But our observation is that there are 2 pieces of legislation which are being used to take away land from people in rural areas. And this is the Mines and Minerals Act of 1961 and the Communal Lands Act of 1981. The Mines and Minerals Act, it gives a lot of power to mineral title holders, whilst the Communal Lands Act does not live up to its title, which seems to be empowering people, but actually it disempowers people by still confirming that anyone with mineral title has got a lot of authority over people living on communal lands. So I will look at actual displacements, threats of displacement, and the likelihood of displacement. I think in the post-independence era, the most severe and wide-scale displacement that Zimbabwe has witnessed was in Marange, which started in 2009. First, there was the violent military takeover of parts of Marange between from 27 October 2008, and the operation went on for several years, up to around 2013. They were still, the military was still forcing people off Marange. This is mainly because at first, the land that was known to have diamonds was very small, but as they continued to discover more diamonds, more people were targeted for displacement. So in 2009, that's when 2 mining companies were brought to Marange. That was Mbada Diamonds and Canadale. And here we see the beginning of the problems, where a license is given to a mining company. The local people are not consulted, they are not part of the equation. So the president invoked his power. You know, the minerals are vested in the president. The communal lands are also vested in the president. And in that photo, you see the former president and the incumbent, which must also give you an idea of the continuity that we have in terms of our policies with regard to land, because nothing has changed. The same vulnerabilities that existed before have continued even under the new dispensation. So when they moved into Marange, at first they told the people that they should depart voluntarily, but the people resisted. And after a while, there was this standoff, and then there was this ZANU-PF conference that was held in Mutare at the Marymount Teachers College in December 2010. That's when government deployed the military into Marange, and the people were told to pack their belongings and get onto the trucks at gunpoint. And when people were forced off their homes, there were bulldozers on standby, which moved into the villages and demolished the people's homes as they watched. And there was no valuation of properties that was destroyed. There was no written agreement between those who were demolishing the houses and those who owned those properties. So a lot of people left Marange in tears. They were crying as they saw everything they had ever worked for reduced to a rubble. And you see this picture now as they were now living. These were the trucks that they used to carry the belongings that could be salvaged. And when they arrived in Marange, there was also there was no land for cultivation. They didn't care about ensuring that these people can continue with their lives. I think the real issue was to get them off the diamond fields. So these people who were self-reliant, now we see them signing for food handouts. You can see that elderly woman there as she's getting food handouts at Ada Transal. And then I moved to also Chilonga, where our government wanted to displace. They still have the intention to move hundreds of people off their land in Chilonga. And I have put here the statutory instrument 50 of 2021, which was issued early this year. And it clearly said that the Minister of Local Government, Urban and Rural Development, in terms of Section 10 of the Communal Land Act, hereby makes the following notice. This notice may be cited as a communal land setting aside of land. The area of land described here under in terms of the schedule shall be set aside with effect from the day that this statutory instrument was published. And it continued to say any person occupying or using the land specified in the schedule, otherwise than by virtue of a right held in terms of the Mines and Minerals Act, is ordered to depart permanently with all of his or her property from the said land by the date of publication of this notice, unless he or she acquires rights of use or occupation of the said land in terms of Section 9 of the Communal Land Act. So they were expected to depart that very day that this statutory instrument was issued. If we go down, you also realize that there was a threat of imprisonment if they did not depart from that land. So we had to rush to court to stop this implementation of this statutory instrument, and government later withdrew, but the threat of eviction remains. So currently there are over 100 communities that are facing displacements in Zimbabwe. And these threats are coming in the form of special grants, which are being issued. And there are two people who are able to issue the special grants. We have the president, who is issuing special grants according to the Mines and Minerals Act. The president is the one who can give special grants over oil, coal, and gas. So you've got the whole of Mbire district and the Mzarabani district, where exploration for coal, for oil and gas is undergoing right now. And the president has already issued special grants, which means if this company is going to proceed into the drilling stage, tens of thousands of people are going to be displaced. And the government refused to compensate them because, according to the Communal Lands Act, the people living in communal land in Zimbabwe, they do not own that land. It is owned by rural district councils and vested in the president. So what is the likelihood that these communities are going to be displaced? It all depends now with what the companies that are currently doing exploration are going to find. There are some areas where there is a likelihood that the current exploration projects are going to bring positive results. For example, in Dinde, in Hwange, the community say they've seen the Chinese celebrating that they've managed to find good grade of coal. It therefore means those people are likely to be displaced. Where maybe they don't get a very good quantity of what they are looking for, perhaps that will discourage them from going into full-time mining. But Zimbabwe is open for business mantra is exposed millions of Zimbabweans to displacement, mainly because if the minerals are discovered wherever in this country, people are likely going to lose their land without any compensation. And of course, finally, we also have situations where people are not told to move, but a mining company makes the place uninhabitable, such that people move away for their own safety and security. This is happening like in the Hwange area, where the companies are digging very deep pits And when the rain falls, it collects in these pits, which becomes very hazardous. We're dealing with a case of a boy who went swimming into that pit where water had collected, and he ended up being attacked by a crocodile. And some of them are drowning in these pits, and the families, some are deciding to move away to places where they can raise their children in a safe environment. So I will end here for now, and thank you very much once again, Dr. Rafmo.
All right, thank you very much for that summary of just a very, very small part of what's actually happening within the rural areas with mining, with infiltration, with the state acquisition. I had actually asked Maxine whether she could perhaps comment on all of these SIs and their actual constitutionality with regard to the Bill of Rights. Maxine, are you in a position to comment?
Yes, I actually am here. I think mostly with the SIs, I think it's we just have a blatant disregard of observing we just, can you see me? Sorry. Yes, no?
Yes.
All right. I think to comment on the undermining of the Constitution by all these SIs and failure for the state to protect the Bill of Rights, I do believe that it's literally the state turning a blind eye, because if the courts, as high as the Supreme Court, has said that these SIs are unconstitutional, and if we all know that these SIs are unconstitutional, then there is no reason for us not to repeal the laws, which means that the Minister of Local Government is literally, because this SI, the SI 109 of 1979, was enacted by the Minister of Local Government then, meaning that the Minister of Local Government now is to stand and to say that, okay, this is a part of law that we do not want anymore, something that we don't want the city councils overall to be using. So that's also that's also responsibility on the sake of the city council. And just to comment as well on the constitutionality of all the failure to protect the Bill of Rights by the state, I think we are not committed, especially to Section 78, because if you look at how our Constitution is set up, our Section 78 and our Section 28, so to put it in an equation, Section 78 and Section 28 of Zimbabwe is exactly equal to Section 26 of South Africa on the right to shelter, adequate housing, against arbitrary evictions, etc. But South Africa now has even taken the extra step to put in an act, the Unlawful Occupiers and Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act, which states step by step what a court is supposed to do and how a court is supposed to get to the judgment of issuing a court order regarding evictions. So I guess it sounds quite flimsy to say, but I think we are just not committed to the protection of this Bill of Rights. And it is a culture and a nature that we need to overturn as a people. And even when we are doing our advocacy work in alignment of laws with the Constitution, it's something that we definitely need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you for that clarification. And I think it's something that we often fail to put front and foremost in a lot of our conversations is our undermining of the Constitution on such a regular basis, and the impact on this on the population's confidence in the social contract between the government and the population. I'm going to open the floor. I see there are no raised hands. If people would like to comment or ask questions, please feel free to raise your hand and to make a comment.
As they come, Dr. Lovemore, can I just respond to a point raised by Tony on trauma?
Absolutely, please do.
Thank you. So yes, when these people were moved from Marange to Ada Transao, there were so many issues of trauma that they suffered. One of it is that when men left Marange, they were like conquered and moved into an area where they could not feed their families. There was a change in terms of breadwinners. We saw women now having to sell grass. They would cut grass and firewood to go and sell at Odzi business center. That was not enough. Children, we saw them also being involved in child labor, helping their mothers to carry bundles of grass and firewood. We also have situations where parents were forced into a very small housing unit with their children we have just married. And there was a lot of distress that came upon them. And also the issue of traditional leadership. There was a loss of authority. For instance, the people of Marange identify with Chief Marange, that they live under Chief Marange. It's their traditional figurehead. When they were moved to Ada Transao, they were now under Chief Zimunya. They were treated as people who came, they were like refugees in the Zimunya area. And when they were caught like cutting grass and fire by the Zimunya people and forced to work as punishment in the fields or whatever the people of Zimunya wanted them to do. We don't know what else abuses they could have suffered, but there was a lot of tension and it is still there. We were in Ada with Parliament 3 weeks ago, and the people were still saying they don't feel like they are accepted or tolerated by the Zimunya people. So there is this contestation between the Marange people and the owners of the territory where they are in now. I also heard the reports of domestic violence happening as a result of the loss of livelihoods, loss of authority. People have been fighting in their homes as they try to adjust to the new realities of living in a place where they have no source of livelihood, no income, no traditional leadership. They've lost their shrines. Church members were separated. Families were separated. So I think a lot of research needs to be done to look at to what extent have these people been affected psychologically because of this relocation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for those comments. I think I would like to comment at this point is that we haven't really highlighted, Farai, the violence in the mining areas against the villagers and people living in the areas by the security guards. And we certainly see a number of cases per month of very nasty violence against villagers and passers-by by the security companies. We haven't also spoken about the exploitation of labor by the mining companies and the appalling conditions under which some Zimbabweans are working, and the artisanal mining issues, the violence and crime that is now becoming a national issue, just because of the insecurity of tenure, the lack of regulatory frameworks, and the fact that it's becoming a factional war zone within many areas of Zimbabwe. Right, I'm going to ask if you could maybe just comment on the artisanal mining and the violence and crime that we are seeing, because I think that is an important point. You know, when the frameworks are so undermined and so unstructured, it enables all sorts of other things to be happening as well.
Thank you, Dr. Lovemore. Yes, artisanal mining in Zimbabwe, we call it organized chaos, whereby on the surface they appear very disorganized, but if you get closer, you realize that there is actually political organization in every artisanal mining region in the country. And because of the involvement of politicians, they have a lot of power, artisanal miners, over the local villages. Only last month, we had a situation in Penalonga where the local people ended up arming themselves with wars, spears and the like, attacking artisanal miners from Midlands who are very politically connected and operating under a guy who formed a company that forged a partnership with Metal on Gold to have a 70-30% mining partnership at Red Wing in Penalonga. We are seeing it also in Mazoe, where artisanal mining is very politically connected. We are seeing emergence of a kind of some warlords in this country, which is, it's going to be a big threat to national security, especially if government does not come in to regularize this sector. I don't even know the role these people are going to play in 2023 election, but they've been given a lot of power and protection. And we are also seeing artisanal miners taking over land that belong to villagers. If there is gold there, we receive a lot of complaints from villagers who say, they are digging in my land. I've approached the Minister of Mines, but nothing is being done. And on that point, I also want to add the ineffectiveness of the environmental management agents, EMA. They are supposed to be ensuring that the environment is protected and that mining takes place within the armpits of the law. But because of the politicization and the militarization of the artisanal mining sector, environmental management agents officials are now helpless. They're just watching as the artisanal miners go on a rampage with the protection that they're getting from the politicians of this country. Thank you.
Thanks, Farai. Thank you very much for that. I think Tony is asking for Maxine to comment on the Archaic Mining Act. I know there is an act in process, but none of us, as usual, know what's happening.
Interestingly, as Veritas, we've actually done a bill watch on this, on what the Mining Act looks like. Interestingly, we came to the conclusion that the Mining Act is probably, most likely, constitutional. But then to mean that it's constitutional doesn't necessarily mean that it's equitable or desirable, because it doesn't capture the policies that we now stand for now, today. So I'm sorry, I just want to go back to the question, comments on Archaic Mining Act. So of course, I do know, as Dr. Francis mentioned, that there is work being done in order to change it. Whether these types of provisions that apply to the communal land scenario will be changed, we are not sure. But as I've mentioned, interestingly, we found it to be constitutional, but not equitable or desirable.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase, equitable and desirable. Okay, so I just want to know, are there any more questions? I don't see any hands raised. Anybody wanting more comments on any particular aspect that we've discussed this evening?
There's Kennedy there. Where's that up? Kennedy.
Kennedy, sorry, I can't see your hand, but please carry on.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. Yeah, my question is on compensation. To say, like, what does our law say about compensating the people like who would have been involuntarily like displaced, especially in the mining sector? What does the mining act say, the communal lands or like act say about compensation? If they are provision for compensation, who is supposed to compensate the victims? The mining companies or the government, or both? Yeah, so I just want to know if there is clarity on that issue of compensation, because we are seeing like a lot of cases where some are getting compensation, some are not getting compensation, and those who are getting compensation, they are not getting adequate compensation. Thank you so much.
Kennedy, thank you. Maxine, would you like to answer that question before Tony? I see Tony, your hand is up, but maybe Maxine can answer that question first.
I wanted to actually ask if Farai wants to answer it first, then I can go after him.
Farai, carry on.
I think what the Communal Lands Act say is that they should be given alternative land. As to others getting compensation, I'm not aware of anyone who got compensation from the government of Zimbabwe. We had the case of Murowa Diamonds, which moved about 100 families from the Maziwa communal lands of Rishawan when they started developing their mine. These ones were compensated, but they were compensated by the mine. I am not very sure how much they were given, but I think it is seen as the best model in the Zimbabwean context, where people were really, there was an agreement, kind of. And then in the case of Marange, they were given only $1,000 disturbance fee. That was the title given to the money that they were given, but it was not compensation. Thank you.
Thanks, Farai. Maxine, would you like to comment? And then I'll also make a comment.
I totally agree with what Farai is saying. There's something interesting in the Miners Act where miners have to pay royalty to the government on minerals that are taken from their locations. But then these royalties are paid to ZIMRA, and then they go on to the Consolidated Revenue Fund, etc. There is actually no provision in the Act for payments to be made to inhabitants, so the people that they took off from the communal lands, etc. But this is something to think about, especially when the new Mining Act is coming into play, that how are we going to compensate these so-called people, and where are we going to pull this money from? Is part of this fund perhaps supposed to go towards compensating those people? So these are all things that perhaps are in maybe our recommendations when we're talking about this.
Thanks, Maxine. Thank you. I just would like to make a comment that compensation and restitution should be equitable and desirable. And if we do a study of all of the displacement, both pre-independence and post-independence, much of the land that has been reallocated has been far from equitable or desirable to the people who've been resettled. And I think if we take the Tokyo Makosi displacement, the land that they were allocated is basically unusable. It's drought struck and the water supply is saline. And the people are very unhappy, and they're being extremely bullied by the sugarcane farmers. So it's always a downgrade. It's if there was an upgrade when you were displaced, it would be slightly more palatable. But I think that this always downgrading our population to a less desirable situation is actually very sad. So are there any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to hand back to the panelists to just give a quick summary of where we think we've got to in this discussion. And then maybe I'm going to hand back to Ibo to close out for us. So I'm going to, Tony, would you like to comment? And then I'll hand to Maxine and then to Farai in that order. And then we'll hand over to Ivo.
Thank you. I want to go back to the beginning of the things I said and the impact upon people. To be moved from place is a massive traumatic event. And Francis, you raised the notion of intergenerational trauma. Many years ago, a very wise woman, Yael Danieli, looked at the consequences of the Holocaust on the Holocaust survivors. And what she found was that trauma lived for at least another 2 generations after the event. That's the consequence of displacements. So when we start to think about displacements in the current context, and we have not dealt with the burden, as you pointed out, of all the displacements that have taken place for 130 years, or Murumba, or the land invasions, or the Liberation War, we have to think right now about a human consequence that is distinct and opposition to the notion of property rights. It matters where people live. And in a country where so many of our people live in land that they have been on for generations, the idea that you get another piece of property is a trivial response to what people will have to experience. So in the Constitution that Maxine was talking about, the section that talks about nobody shall be evicted, essentially without due cause. And due cause must take into account the human effect of what that means. Then we have to change the debate. We have to change the debate from property and development to people. And this becomes a really critical thing for me, because if you move them, as we've seen, and the evidence is there, the evidence is unimpeachable, the consequences to people, their families, and their communities is devastating. And until we put that in front of people, and people understand, as that very poignant case made by Maxine, of a family who created place and then had their place destroyed in a matter of minutes, until we understand that that impact has an impact on the family, on the community, and on the next generation, and everyone else around them, until we begin to understand that, and we begin to think about the human consequence against the economic consequence. We all love the macroeconomic picture that the country is paying its debts, etc., but it pays its debts too often on the consequences to people's lives. So for me, it's how do we begin to raise the debate? Somebody posted in the thing, what do we do? Well, I suggest one of the first things we do is to begin to shift the dialogue from property and development to people. And once we begin to engage people, then we'll think much more carefully about property and development. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I hand to you, Farai, or Maxine actually next, and then Farai.
Thank you, Francis. I think one thing that is of great importance is actually the launch of this report. So many times in our country, especially, there are rights that seem to get lost because they are ones that make it on the news daily and the ones that don't. And as Tony kept referring and saying, these things are things that are happening every day, but they're just in the background. So the launch of this report, to the person in the comments who was saying that Zimbabweans are tired, what now, where do we go? the launch of this report is the first step. To those of us who work in spaces that have the ability to make change, we are going to go back. I'm going to go back to Veritas, and I'm going to report back and say that, okay, here where the questions were raised on archaic law, when we are now lobbying and advocating for the change of the Mining Act, for new acts to come forward, how are we drafting in a way that addresses all the situations and the concerns that we have spoken about? And one thing that we really need to look at, especially with the question of compensation, I think that one is important, because we speak of compensation, but how are we going to bring this principle into practice? So as Tony mentioned, this was a good start for the conversation. It's time that we shift the conversation from development to people, to actually seeing how we are going to change the lives of each individual that has been affected. What now? You know, we're talking about the starting point of demolitions, but what about the people who've already suffered the demolitions and who have been arbitrarily evicted, the people who are homeless? How are we going to cater to those people legally? So in closing, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who was actually on this platform, people who were asking the questions and people who were the panelists, because this has paved a new way for us to be able to think in a new direction that's effective.
Thanks, Maxine. Farai?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lavmo. I think there are three things which I would like to propose. Number one is legislative reform. The Constitution is the supreme governing law of Zimbabwe. And if the Mines and Minerals Act and the Communal Lands Act are out of sync with the Constitution, then we need to make a lot of noise to force the repealing of those outdated pieces of legislation and demand updated mineral legislation and the Communal Lands Act that does not victimize our people. Secondly, human rights lawyers need to challenge displacement in the course of law using the supreme law of the country. I was very much relieved listening to Maxine speaking, and if such lawyers can work with organizations even like ours who are deep in the communities where these things are happening, then we can refer cases to you and take these issues up with the course of law and expose the injustice which these legislations represent. And third, civic education. Zimbabweans must know that displacement is unconstitutional and that they need to organize themselves. Otherwise, we need to build power from below and bring those people out in those communities into the equation so that they can have their own agency and challenge displacement. Even when people come to try to displace them, they need to stand their ground and say, we are not going anywhere, you know, and defend their territory. So I think those three things, we need to come together and pursue them. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And I think in summary, I think Miles highlighted it. Once again, we've highlighted the challenges. We have some solutions, but we need to keep moving forward. I see Maxine's dropped off, which is sad because I was trying to message her. I must say that our speakers have been... Are you there? Well, yes. Hi. Our speakers tonight have been superb, and thank you for a brilliant discussion. I want to hand back to Eva because I don't want to drag on. So Eva, maybe you could close off for us.
Thanks, Francis. Before I thank you and the panelists, just acknowledge some of the people far and wide. My brother, George Nzongola and Talaja from DRC, but in the US. Thanks for joining us. Reward Dimsha Basa in the UK. Jennifer Mohammed Keterere in South Africa, Greg Powell, Chris Mkofa in the UK, Crystal Melly, Fei Chung, who's now become a regular in the policy dialogue, and Jane in Malawi. Thank you for joining us. Again, we're looking at a very intense subject, which is not just peculiar or applicable to Zimbabwe. The subject of human rights, organized violence and torture, and forcible displacements. It's said that the history of contemporary Southern Africa, with its mineral curse, has become a history of displacements in the colonial era, and sadly, in this era. And Zimbabwe, DRC, Zambia, and even South Africa are illustrative of the new expansion, albeit that which was in the hands of people like Sister Joros now have the Chinese leading the pack. And therefore, the points raised by Farai in closing, the need for legislative reform, the need for human rights organizations, civil society to challenge displacements, the need for civic education in particular. You can see when we discuss such things as corruption, human rights, forcible displacements, one would expect, given the importance of this subject, that we'll have more people engaged in such discussions. You can see it's very limited. And it's almost like Zimbabweans have become immune to issues of corruption, to issues of human rights, to issues of displacements. It's sad. I don't know how we can raise that level of consciousness towards a more sensitive response to things happening every day around us. And therefore, I'd like to thank Tony for his passionate representation and his description of place. I have not seen that kind of description before. It is so profound. To Maxine, as you see, a young lawyer, so versed in the subject, and Farai, an old comrade who has been in the trenches for a long time and has been on this platform a number of times. One has to acknowledge the enormous work that Farai and his organization are doing across the country. It's something we'll never thank you enough, Farai. And of course, our eminent moderator, Francis, who has always been in the background, but today we got into the chair itself and conducting such a intelligently the discussion the way you have. Thank you very much. As you all know, the members of this platform, of this policy dialogue, this is recorded, it will be transcribed and published in the form of a policy brief, which will be online and also in hard copy. And we will through that sort of launch a new form of dissemination through which to sensitize our populations at home and abroad in the region to issues which are very pertinent to our region now. Next policy dialogues on the 4th of November. We return its election mood in Zimbabwe. And election mood is almost back to the war zone. Already, the issue of violence raises the question whether we will ever get to the 2023 elections in Zimbabwe. So we'd like to look at that, the ramifications, and whether we should be looking at more a bold and resolute decision to discuss something other than just elections. Is it possible to get a national, regional, and international consensus to some kind of settlement given that elections, certainly in Zimbabwe, have not been a solution to our problems. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us, and in particularly the panelists who have been very active and in producing the report, which we will help in disseminating. Thank you very much and good night.
Kaina pana mawa na kokate.